1993, Walter Hayes did something his entire county called foolish. He sold the most valuable animal on his farm, not to pay his mortgage, not to fix his equipment, not to save his own livelihood. He sold it for a homeless teenager nobody believed in, and for 31 years nobody heard a word from that boy again. Then one quiet July morning, more than 40 trucks rolled down Walter's gravel road, and an entire town had to stop and catch its breath. The farmland outside Rolla, Missouri had a way of making time feel slow. The kind of place where summer mornings smell like cut grass and diesel fuel, where neighbors know your name and your business, and where a man's word still means something. Walter Hayes had worked that land his entire life. At 52, he carried the posture of a man built by labor, broad-shouldered, sun-darkened, with calloused hands and a beard gone mostly gray. 6 feet tall, quiet in the way that deep rivers are quiet, still on the surface, moving hard underneath. This story has been dramatized and reconstructed for narrative and inspirational purposes. Names, dialogue, and specific details may have been altered or fictionalized. The events depicted are intended to illustrate themes of kindness, sacrifice, and perseverance. Viewer discretion is advised. This content is meant to inspire, not to represent a fully verified news report. People in Rolla respected Walter. They always had. What they didn't know, what he never let anyone fully see, was how close to the edge he was standing. Corn prices had been falling for years. Equipment kept breaking down. The old combine harvester spent more time in the repair shed than in the field. Every week brought a new bill. Every month brought a new payment he wasn't sure he could make. His wife, Evelyn, knew. She always knew, even when he didn't say it. Evelyn was 48 then, slender, steady, with green eyes that held warmth even through the hardest winters. She watched her husband carry his worry the way farmers carry everything, silently, without complaint, like it was just part of the work. Walter wasn't sleeping well. He was sitting on the porch until midnight, staring out at fields he wasn't sure would still be his come spring. That was the summer everything changed. It was late July, hot enough to make the gravel shimmer. Walter was bent over a hydraulic line in the equipment shed when movement caught his eye. A figure coming up the road, slow, heavy-footed, the kind of walk that belongs to someone carrying more than just a backpack. The young man was maybe 18, tall but thin in the way that says hunger, not youth. His clothes were dusty. His boots were separating at the soles. His backpack had been repaired so many times it barely held together. But it was his eyes that made Walter stop. Not lazy, not entitled, not asking for pity, just tired. The deep, quiet tired that settles into a person when they've been disappointed too many times too young. Walter wiped his hands and walked out to meet him. The teenager said his name was Ethan Brooks, said he was from Kansas, said he'd been on the road a few weeks and was looking for work. The real story came out slowly. His mother had remarried. The stepfather had made life unbearable. One night an argument crossed a line and Ethan was told to leave and not come back. He'd walked out with a backpack, less than $40, and no plan. The money ran out fast. So did the options. "I don't need much," Ethan said. "Just a meal, maybe a few hours of work." Walter studied him for a long moment. Logic said no. The farm was already stretched beyond what it could support. There was no budget for another worker, not even a temporary one. But Walter Hayes wasn't running entirely on logic that day. "Have you eaten?" he asked. Ethan hesitated just long enough. That hesitation told Walter everything he needed to know. "Come on," Walter said. "We're having supper soon." Ethan ate slowly that first night, then faster. Evelyn filled his plate twice before he finally slowed down. Walter watched him carefully. He noticed something during dinner. Whenever the conversation drifted toward machinery, the boy leaned in. Real attention, not polite nodding. Genuine hunger for the information. The next morning, Walter put him to work, and Ethan worked harder than grown men twice his age had ever worked on that farm. Up before sunrise, still going after dark. Not a complaint. Not a request for easier assignments, but every evening the same thing happened. Ethan would drift toward the workshop. He'd stand quietly while Walter repaired something, watching, absorbing, learning. One evening, Walter handed him a wrench. Ethan caught on immediately. Within days, he was helping with repairs. Within a few weeks, he was diagnosing problems himself. That's when Walter understood something important. This boy didn't love farming. He loved machines. and the realization that followed was one Walter carried silently for the rest of the summer. The knowledge that sitting in front of him, hungry and homeless, was a young man who had somewhere to be. Someone he was supposed to become. He just needed someone willing to believe it first. As summer wound down, Walter faced a decision. The vocational training center in Springfield had a program: diesel engines, hydraulic systems, agricultural machinery, electrical diagnostics. A real trade, a real future. Tuition wasn't free. And Walter didn't have the money, so he sold his best Black Angus bull. Every farmer in Rolla knew what that bull was worth. Not just in dollars, though it was the most valuable animal on the farm, but in what it represented. Years of careful breeding, future income, security against uncertain seasons. Walter knew all of that. He sold it anyway. Neighbors shook their heads. Some laughed. Some said the pressure had finally gotten to him, that he'd gone soft and traded away his security for some drifter kid who'd probably disappear the moment he had bus fare. Walter never said a word in response. He drove Ethan to the bus station, shook his hand, and watched him climb aboard. Then he drove home. And for 31 years, he heard nothing. The vocational school was harder than Ethan expected. He arrived with a duffel bag, almost no money and no family waiting to catch him if he fell. He rented a small room above an auto parts store from an old widower named Leonard Pierce, a man who charged almost nothing and quietly left extra food outside Ethan's door without ever making it into a conversation. During the day, Ethan studied. At night, he worked at a local repair garage for a mechanic named Frank Delaney, who was rough around the edges but respected effort above everything. Ethan earned that respect fast, but halfway through his first year, the money was gone. Tuition, rent, books, food, everything he earned disappeared before the month ended. Some weeks he survived on instant noodles and discounted bread. Some days he skipped meals entirely just to cover a textbook. One cold evening, staring at an overdue tuition notice, Ethan came closer to quitting than he ever admitted to anyone. He sat alone in his tiny room. The math didn't work. The doubt was loud. 3 days later, a plain envelope arrived from Missouri. Inside was $50 and a handwritten note. Don't quit when you're halfway there. Walter Hayes. Ethan read it over and over. That $50 probably took Walter a week to scrape together. Maybe more. Ethan knew exactly what it cost. He knew exactly what it meant. He made himself a promise that night. Whatever came next, he would finish. The note went into his wallet, where it would stay for the next 3 decades. By 1998, Ethan had graduated near the top of his class. He took a position as a field service technician with an agricultural equipment company in Nebraska. At 23, for the first time in his life, things were moving in the right direction. Then a rainy October highway took it apart in seconds. A freight truck lost control. The collision sent Ethan's vehicle into a ditch. When he woke up in a hospital bed, multiple fractures, uncertain recovery. A doctor was carefully preparing him for the possibility that he might not return to physical field work. Ethan looked at the worn note sitting on his bedside table. Don't quit when you're halfway there. He committed to rehabilitation the same way he once committed to that Missouri farm, completely without reservation, one day at a time. He came back. And when he finally opened his first agricultural repair shop years later, that note was still in his wallet. Over the following decades, Brooks Agricultural Services grew across multiple states. Hundreds of farms, a respected name, real success. But Ethan never forgot where he started, and he never forgot who made it possible. By the spring of 2024, Walter Hayes was 83 years old. The farm was still standing, but just barely. A decade of climbing costs, falling margins, and bad seasons had buried him in debt. Fuel prices, fertilizer, equipment that needed replacing faster than income could justify. He had borrowed, then borrowed again, then borrowed to cover the borrowing. A stack of unopened bank letters sat in the bottom drawer of his desk, not because he'd forgotten them, but because he couldn't bring himself to read them again. Evelyn was 79 now, still steady, still warm, but she had begun noticing her husband sitting on the porch after midnight, staring into the dark. Just thinking, he always said. The truth was heavier than that. He was watching the clock run out on everything his family had built across more than a century. And he was carrying that alone the way he had always carried things, quietly without complaint, like it was just part of the work. Several states away, Ethan Brooks had no idea any of this was happening, until a customer mentioned it. Nathan Mercer was a weathered rancher who paid attention to struggling farmers the way people pay attention to weather, carefully, because it mattered. "You remember Walter Hayes from Missouri?" he said one afternoon. Ethan stopped. "Heard things aren't going well." That night, Ethan sat alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home. He opened his wallet. The note was still there, faded, yellowed at the edges. The ink thin now, but readable. "Don't quit when you're halfway there." He picked up the phone. Within 48 hours, his financial team sent him a complete report on the Hayes farm. Loan balances, equipment conditions, outstanding obligations, operating losses. Ethan read through it in silence. Then he closed the file and stared out the window for a long time. He made a decision. No emails, no letters, no phone calls. 31 years was long enough. It was time to go home. Walter woke before sunrise the way he always did. He pulled on his denim jacket, poured a cup of black coffee, and stepped onto the front porch to watch the morning arrive across the fields. Then he heard the engines. At first he thought it was highway traffic, but it kept growing louder, closer. He walked to the railing. What he saw made his stomach drop. A convoy stretched down the gravel road as far as he could see. Service trucks, equipment trailers, heavy-duty pickups, parts carriers, one after another. Dozens of them. Walter's first thought was the bank. After months of collection notices and unanswered letters, his mind went straight to the worst possibility. Foreclosure crews, repossession, the end. Evelyn appeared at the door and saw the color drain from his face. Neighbors gathered along fences. Word was already moving through Rolla before the convoy reached the gate. People assumed corporate buyers, foreclosure teams. Nobody guessed the truth. Sheriff Dale Morrison stood near the edge of the crowd, watching. He'd grown up in this county. He'd seen too many family farms disappear. Even he looked confused. "Never seen anything like this," he said. The trucks rolled through the gate and stopped. More than 40 vehicles filled the property. Technicians climbed out. Equipment specialists began examining tractors. Hydraulic experts moved through the machinery. Tool cases opened. Work began. Nobody presented legal documents. Nobody said a word about foreclosure. Then a silver pickup parked near the barn. The door opened. A man stepped out, around 50, confident but not arrogant, silver threading through dark hair, a trimmed beard framing his jaw. His hands showed the scars of someone who had spent years working with machinery, regardless of what his business card said. He looked directly at Walter. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the man smiled. A familiar smile, one Walter hadn't seen in more than 30 years. "Mr. Hayes," the man said quietly. "It's Ethan." The coffee cup slipped from Walter's hand and shattered on the ground. For a moment, Walter just stood there. His mind was trying to connect the successful man in front of him with the skinny, sunburned teenager who had walked up his gravel road carrying a torn backpack in the summer of 1993. Then the memories came all at once. The workshop, the heat, the bull, the bus station. Walter crossed the distance between them. Neither man cared who was watching. Around them, dozens of people stood in complete silence. Neighbors who had laughed at Walter's decision 31 years ago stood with tears running down their faces. Even Sheriff Morrison turned away briefly. When they finally stepped apart, Ethan reached into his truck and brought out a wooden frame. Inside was a photograph, taken in the summer of 1993. Two younger versions of themselves, standing beside an old tractor in the workshop. Walter's arm across Ethan's shoulders, both of them smiling. Beside the photograph was something else, a faded $50 bill, and the note. The same note, yellowed at the edges, ink gone thin. "Don't quit when you're halfway there." Walter looked up. "You didn't just give me a job," Ethan said softly. "You gave me a future." For the next several weeks, the convoy stayed on the farm. Specialists worked from sunrise to evening every single day. Every major tractor was inspected and repaired. Every hydraulic system was rebuilt. The aging combine harvester received a complete overhaul. Electrical systems were modernized. The workshop roof was repaired. The barn doors were replaced. Equipment Walter had long considered beyond saving came back to life. The work was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ethan never once brought up money. A week in, he asked Walter to come into town. They drove to a red brick law office near the courthouse square. The attorney, Rebecca Collins, slid a thick stack of documents across the table. Walter put on his glasses. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. Then he stopped. At the bottom of the final document, 2 words, paid in full. Every loan, every operating debt, every outstanding obligation gone. The foreclosure process had been terminated. The liens released, the mortgage satisfied. For the first time in decades, the Hayes farm belonged entirely and completely to Walter Hayes. He lowered the papers slowly. His eyes found Ethan across the table. "Why?" he whispered. Ethan reached into his jacket and placed the old note between them. "I carried this for 31 years, he said. Every time I wanted to quit, I read it." Walter stared at the faded paper. He had completely forgotten writing it. To him, it had been a small thing, almost an afterthought. To Ethan, it had been a compass, but Ethan still wasn't finished. He drove Walter back to the farm and walked him to the old cabin behind the horse barn. Walter stopped walking. The cabin was unrecognizable. Fresh paint, new windows, a rebuilt porch, flowers at the entrance. Above the doorway, a large wooden sign read, Walter Hayes Scholarship Fund. Ethan explained what he had built. Every year, the fund would provide full vocational training scholarships to young people with nowhere else to turn. Homeless teenagers, kids aging out of foster care, young adults from struggling rural communities who were willing to work but had never been given a real chance. 50 students per year, every scholarship covering tuition, tools, housing support, and job placement. Walter listened without speaking. Then he asked the only question that mattered to him. "Why my name?" Ethan looked at the cabin, the same cabin where he had slept as an 18-year-old with $40 and no future. "Because none of this belongs to me," he said. "If you hadn't given me a chance, there is no Ethan Brooks." 1 year later, the first graduating class gathered in the new training center built beside that cabin. Young men and women who had once been homeless. Kids who had been told they would never amount to anything. People who had simply needed one person to believe in them before they could believe in themselves. Walter stood before them as the guest speaker. His voice was slower now. His hands trembled slightly. But the room was completely still. As he looked out at those young faces, Walter finally understood something that had taken him more than 30 years to fully grasp. The most valuable thing he had ever given away was not the bull. It was not the $50. It was not the summer of work. It was a chance. One simple, costly, quietly given chance. 31 years earlier, he had planted a single seed in one life, and that seed had grown into something neither of them could have imagined, something that would keep growing long after both of them were gone. Maybe that's the way it works. Not through dramatic moments, not through overnight miracles, but through ordinary people, ordinary moments, when someone chooses kindness even though it costs something. A shared meal, a warm place to sleep, a note in an envelope, $50 someone couldn't really spare. We rarely see where those moments go. We don't usually find out what they become, but God keeps a better record than we do. If you're carrying a burden right now that no one else can see, if you're wondering whether your sacrifice, your patience, or your faith even matters, let this story remind you that it matters far more than you know. If this story moved you today, share it in the comments. What is one act of kindness that changed the direction of your life? And if you're still waiting on your breakthrough, let us know. This community prays together. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. God bless you, your family, your health, and everything you're still believing for. We'll see you in the next one. Share.